Bernard de Montreal. Preparatory Communication Number 91. The Murder of Man by the Occult Forces. Man is a being whose power has been extracted by forces seeking to control matter. This murder, since in fact it is an assassination, is perpetrated on such a scale that murder in all its forms in the world is the most advanced phase, as well as suicide. Man has been murdered by the astral forces that dominate the world of thought. Forces that feed on man's mental and emotional substance, just as man feeds on plant and animal matter. The assassination of man is a global, planetary condition, and will remain so until man, the ego, has fought the forces within him that dictate the way of seeing, the way of reacting, the way of living without his knowledge. Man is totally ready to crack down on the forces within him that dominate his mind and prevent his intelligence from taking possession of the earth. But the ego is weak, because it has only been fed with garbage and illusions. Man has been so fed with garbage and illusions that it is almost impossible for him, alone, without any help whatsoever, to get out of this stagnation, and to exterminate within him the forces that seek to control his will or veil his intelligence. The human being is a perfectly organized being in terms of energy, but where disorder reigns in him, it is where his intelligence and will remain captive of any illusions that are part of the psychological enchantment of humanity. Man is a superior being in power. But this power cannot explode in broad daylight because he lives in the night of its experience. He lives outside its own walls. He lives according to the law of the dead man, of the man murdered by the forces of life inferior to himself, that is, inferior to his intelligence and will. The assassination of man is so great that today he has lost the power to know, to levitate, to burst, to transmute, etc. He has lost what rightfully belongs to him, because he has lost the ability to rise above the psychological spell that covers the surface of the earth. He has the impression of being two, an inner part and an outer part, when in fact he is only one, and any perception leading him to believe that he is two is a perception relating to this terrible condition of being, incapacitated by the blindness of his astralized intelligence. Man's greatest trap is his way of seeing things. And man's greatest danger is his inability to change his vision, his understanding, because he is afraid to be one. He is afraid to be absolute. He is afraid to be without reflection. The mystery of religion lies at the bottom of this sphere, of this cave where the ego is grounded to pray better, in order to be better exploited by forces that seem to him to be good and elevated, when in fact they take away its power to maintain man under their secular, millenary contribution. The unity of man is essential to his survival, to his will, to his intelligence. Man can no longer live divided between the material and the immaterial, between mortal and immortal, between temporal and timeless. Man must be holistic, but he can only be if he succeeds in murdering the murderer. The interest of man must be total. That is, man must live totally. And to live totally, he must destroy what prevents him from doing so within himself. Man is fixed on the source of life, but he does not realize it, because between him and the source rises the monster he has created, fear. Fear of everything and nothing. Man is a being whose reality must be unified before he can measure himself and exploit the material world according to the laws of the immaterial world, and the immaterial world according to the laws of the material world. Otherwise, how else do you expect him to realize that the power is in him, and that the power is him, and none other than him? The very substance of life derives from its activity on the plane where the spirit reigns supreme. But not only must the spirit of man reign as master, but man too must reign as master over the domains organized by the spirit, which we call matter, plant and animal. Otherwise, what value does man have other than a purely experiential value that serves the forces in the world of death? When will man understand that death is a dimension that hates him? When will he understand that everything that is dead, whether good or bad, is anti-human? When will man understand that religion loves death? For it is the dead who keep it so that man may join them. For in death, loneliness is great and the spirit dies of boredom. While man, he, the new man, can live without ever dying in his consciousness, because it will have destroyed the assassin of man, the psychological enchantment that is born of his thoughts and tortures his being. It is up to man to explain reality, not to the dead and lonely mind. It is for man alone to explain death and not to the spirit of the dead. For he himself does not know and understand his fate, until he has returned to matter and has himself destroyed the murderer of humanity. Man no longer has to ask anyone to explain reality to him. It is up to him to do so. Now that he knows how to understand the game of the assassin, the game of the astral. Man only has to speak truly, And the spirit of death trembles before his words, because the spirit of death knows that the new man is awakening on earth. And the earth will tremble under the footsteps of this giant who has always slept. Never since man has been man, the world of death has trembled as much as at the end of the 20th century. And that is why the forces of death, the forces of the astral, the forces of the soul will attack the new man to tear off his panache. Man has nothing to fear from the astral than his own fear. For fear leads to madness, and madness is the sweet and smiling daughter of the astral. Man has nothing to fear from madness if he understands that everything that is against him must be destroyed. Everything that is against him must be destroyed. If the astral is against him, man must see it, because it is not the astral that will show him. The murder of man is much more dangerous than the murder of God. For the assassination of God was already a victory for man. But a temporary victory. Because after God, another God appeared in man's mind, and it was the modern God of scientific and technological printing. The God of the machine. Now man is both the murdered God, and tomorrow he will know machines that will come from his power over matter and that will no longer have any influence on his mind. The assassination of man is only possible in the fight he must wage to free himself from the forces that do not want him to feel the infinity of his intelligence. All these forces are anti-human, because they predispose him to live a life that is not up to his standards. As long as man does not have the ability to tear off with his fingers the veil that hides the total consciousness of energy, he realizes that he is in powerlessness, and that this powerlessness is part of his murder. Man must destroy the veil of the astral. But this veil can only be torn with relentlessness. This relentlessness is painful, because the forces do not want man to know that man can benefit from the power of energy that is endless in the visible and invisible cosmos. The new man will gradually move towards the black sun, which is part of the center of the earth and which can only be seen by those who are no longer sons of man, but sons of light. But these sons of light must first see and recognize the shining star, so that they can follow it along the winding slopes that lead to the free path of intelligence, of creative will. Otherwise the darkness is too dense, and man cannot see what cannot be seen alone. He needs the impression that breaks, and opens, and gutters, the closed vase of psychological enchantment that, since man is man, pushes him in search of knowledge without being able to discover only his symbol. The assassination of man is one of the great mysteries of planetary life. Today's man no longer has the mentality of yesterday's man. Today's man, however, is as much a prisoner of his mentality as the ancient man. What allows the man of today to become aware is the phenomenon of the externalization of the spirit of the Aquarian man. In the Aquarian man, the spirit is externalized rather than internalized. And this phenomenon will have global consequences on the future evolution of humanity. For no force is greater, more powerful, than the spirit, since the spirit knows everything in man. In the past, the spirit could not be externalized because man was not yet at the stage of evolution. He was still at the stage of social progress. While tomorrow he will be ready for the evolution of the spirit. Now that social progress will have reached its peak with the electronic age. So the Aquarian man, the man of the new period, individually, will begin to struggle within the envelope created against him by psychological enchantment. And the more he realizes the density of this envelope, the more he will release into himself forces that will break his links with the ancient ideas of humanity. And his spirit will grow more and more expanded, until the day his spirit will command matter. From that moment on, man will enter a new age where the forces of involution will no longer have a hold on him. It will be the end of the assassination of humanity. Man was murdered because the forces of the spirit could not enter into his mental matter. And for his mental matter to receive them, it was necessary for this part of man to develop sufficiently. That is, for man to become aware of himself and his condition. As long as man could not become aware of himself, these forces could not manifest themselves because they were too great and too strong for his soul. But at the end of the 20th century, man can become aware of his condition, because already on Earth this experience has been perfectly lived. Aquarian man now knows what he must know. And nothing can stop man's movement against the forces that prevent his spirit from controlling, through the descent into matter, the conditions of his material life. Everything is in time and time has arrived. The murder of humanity will be revealed to man in its smallest details, so that the mystery will no longer exist on earth with respect to man or the lower kingdom. Everything will be known and man will see that the light is on earth, and no longer encapsulated, wrapped in the shrouds of the astral. The assassination of man will be revealed to man to such an extent that he will want to hide his sight from himself, for he will not want to, or will fear to see, or to understand what will be explained to him. Man does not yet realize that his assassination is a crime against the spirit perpetrated by forces that dominate the greatest spheres of cosmic activity. Man will see for the first time that all knowledge of the earth is but a grain of salt on the infinite shore of creative intelligence. Man cannot be led to recognize reality without help. But as soon as he is touched by it, he cannot refuse it, because it is already felt in him. He can delay it, but he cannot reject it. If today it is still too early, tomorrow it will be time. The assassination of humanity represents various stages of evolution. One of the first stages of evolution linked to this assassination is the fact that man, before being flesh, was a vagrant spirit. That is, a homeless spirit in need of shelter. A shelter was created for him. That is, he himself created his own shelter, his own body, from subtle materials. Once his envelope was created, he only had to penetrate it to inhabit it. But man did not suspect the laws of matter. Since man did not know the laws of matter, he did not know, even as a spirit, that matter was strong, because matter itself is spirit. And he did not know this because it was not the domain of his experience. His descent into matter was a shock because he could not leave it until death had freed him from it. But where does death come from? Death comes from the misuse of the energy of the spirit in matter by a spirit that could not be freed. In other words, if the spirit had known the laws of matter, it would not have been a prisoner of matter, and it would not have had to wait for death to free itself from the carnal envelope. The dilemma of the spirit was therefore twofold. First, imprisonment to death because of ignorance of the spirit, and then imprisonment in matter because of the laws of cause and effect that forced the spirit to remain in matter. If the spirit had known that matter is managed according to the laws of cause and effect, it would not have descended into matter. He would simply have dealt with her without immersing himself in her. But spirit wanted to know the matter, because it represented for him a stop in his incessant movement through the cosmos. Now that this cycle is coming to an end for man, the spirit will be able to inhabit matter without being trapped in it until death. For the new wave of life that will come to Earth in the next centuries will be free from the law of cause and effect, or karma. For a descending spirit will have the power to break the chains of matter so that other spirits can inhabit man according to their desire, without forming a subjective ego or a veil that prevents the spirit from being free in matter. But only the spirit can destroy this veil. And this is what the phenomenon of fusion represents, which is in fact only the perfect union between the spirit and the nature of man. Thus the assassination of humanity comes from the impotence of the spirit of man against matter. And this condition stems from the lack of experience of some spirits, who experienced the experience of descent into matter before being liberated by a spirit who knew its laws. We will ask why some spirits wanted to know the earth, while others did not. And you will be told that in the second case, we discover that it was the spirits of the form who did not want to descend into matter by experience. While the spirits of light consented, provided they were allowed to know the laws and subplanes of matter, which were hidden from them by the forces of darkness, or the archaic forces. But when the spirits of light penetrated the carnal envelope, they could not leave it, because the archaic forces had control over the subplanes of matter, whose astral plane is best known in the esoteric literature of humanity. And when the spirits of light descended into matter, they could not leave until after the death of the material body. That is why we speak of the assassination of humanity, in the sense that it became impossible for man to understand the laws of his evolution, of his origins, because no spirit had, until the end of the 20th century, succeeded in entering matter, forming an unalterable link with the ego, and being free from astral matter, therefore free purely and simply. If humanity had not been sequestered from the deep knowledge that only the spirit could have communicated to it, evolution would have been different, and so would the fate of man. So man had to wait millennia before a new century allowed him to escape the conditions of the psychological enchantment that had been the fate of humanity for so long. It is the Aquarian era that will open the door to the greatest revolution ever known to man since the Spirit descended. Why did the archaic forces keep the laws of their world secret against the spirits of light? Because these forces had been projected out of the enclosure of the worlds of the spirits of light during the Great Rebellion, and their control of the sub-planes of matter became for them the sign of their supremacy in the lower worlds. If the spirits of light had been informed of this situation, man would not have been born on earth. And that is why they were not informed by the spirits of the form who had this knowledge. Thus the mystery of man, the mystery of his unconscious and secular suffering as well as his initiatory suffering, is part of the great plans of evolution of the spirits of form, and not of the spirits of light. That is why man will one day realize, will one day understand, that the form is more powerful than light. And when man has understood this, he will begin to have an idea of the power of form, and why the energy of form is greater than the energy of light. And why all the initiates who came to earth were led by spirits of form and not by spirits of light. And why? For the initiate, the form and understanding of his laws is more important than light and its spiritual manifestation. This is where cosmic science begins. In other words, the total and absolute science of matter and its subplanes. The assassination of humanity also means that man, the material part that has become intelligent because of the perfected ego, can no longer be rejected. That is, destroyed by death, because it is against the laws of form as desired by the spirits of form. Now if the spirits of form have instituted form and its laws, it is obvious that the man who comes from these laws can update these laws on the material level or at least on the subplanes of matter. That is why immortality is not a secondary condition of evolution, but a primary condition that has been sabotaged by the imprisonment of spirits of light ignoring the laws of the subplanes of the matter we know. Then you will say, well, if the spirits of light realized or had realized the condition of incarnation as indicated, why reincarnation? Why does it go down into the matter again? And you will be told that reincarnation does not exist. It was presented to man as a reality by forces that wanted to give him an impression of return in order to lighten the weight of the concept of an absolute death and without return. But on the other hand, it exists because the experiential material contained in the memory, or soul, was constantly reused by other spirits who descended into matter. And since material man is the product of continuous racial genetics, the actions of the ancestors were always reflected in the future of the race by new spirits seeking the experience of descent into matter. Then you will ask, why couldn't the spirits who returned after death inform others of the human condition? And you will be told that they could not because the spirits of light can only return to their world after fusion. That is, when man has been made intelligent by the laws of death. As long as he is not made intelligent of the laws of death, the spirit of light cannot return to the world of light. Because death for man continues after earthly life. And also for the spirit, in the sense that he is obliged to return to matter in order to be finally free of it. Then you will say that we contradict ourselves. That there was a time when the incarnation was denied and in another time it was advocated. Let us look further ahead. Reincarnation means going down into matter. However, the spirit can descend into the form of matter, but cannot descend into matter. That is, be trapped in it in the same way. This means that spirits that have been liberated from matter by death return to it in form and not in experience. And it is these spirits that we find in the astral world. They constantly relive the human experience. Hence their loneliness, pain, sorrow, but do not relive it in the experience. Those who live it in material experience do so for the first and last time. So what is fusion in all this? Well, fusion is a state where the spirit of light can inhabit the form without being trapped in it. Then it is possible for him to form a bond with the mortal, an unalterable bond that will one day cause the spirit of light and the mortal to form a unity. This will allow man to be immortal or to return the spirit when it is ready to return to the world of light. But for the spirit to return to the world of light, it must be totally free from the astral laws that keep it prisoner after death. And this is only possible if the mortal himself is freed from the yoke of psychological enchantment that corresponds to the liberation of his spirit. What is explained to you here is a simple draft. The rest must come with the rest of the instruction. We have to absorb it all in stages, because it is vast and complex, although simple and very unified. It seems, by what is expressed above, that the spirits of light can only return to their world after fusion with the mortal. That's right. That's right. Why? Why? Because matter, the mortal, must be liberated from the grip of the astral. Otherwise the power of archaic forces would continue on earth. For unconscious man represents for them the powerlessness of the spirits of light. When man is conscious, the power of the spirits of light will be on earth. So the light will be on earth. And the new men will be the receptacles for the new spirits who will descend into matter to merge with the mortal. In other words, to merge with a being that will be pleasing to them in terms of experience. For this being can no longer be the object of affabulation by the astral on earth. And the spirit of light will inhabit a new body, as it was initially conceived by the spirits of form. It is still difficult for man to put order into all this mess, but time is on his side and man will understand everything. The assassination of humanity interrupted the original and wonderful plan of descent into the matter of the spirits of light. But this was necessary. Otherwise the human phenomenon would not have occurred. But man himself represents another slice of evolution that must be explained to fully understand the role of light spirits in the universe. Not all spirits of light have the same degree of experience. Some are very advanced, others are less so. and compared to man. This difference is very important because it determines why some men are more advanced than others, more creative than others. And this is interesting because it allows us to observe why not all human beings can understand certain things with the same ease. And this reflects the fact that not all are inhabited by spirits of the same experience. This condition that created on earth the social and political hierarchy, political power, financial power, in other words, power and its hierarchy on earth, is born from the experiential difference of the spirits of light that inhabit man. And as long as man is not conscious, that is, intelligent in spirit, he will not be able to realize himself to the fullest extent of himself. He will seek to place himself in a more pleasant social position, because he will want to experience what other men are experiencing, which are inhabited by more experienced minds. And this is a great illusion of the mortal. As long as he is not conscious of his spirit, for reflection in the ego will push him to make certain gestures that are not in the nature of his spirit, but the result of an egoistic effort. And it is this egoistic or subjective effort that will force a less evolved spirit to lose contact with man. Hence the evil. When the spirit loses contact with man, it continues to inhabit him, but can hardly guide him in life. So man becomes more and more unconscious and succumbs more and more to the astral. So his spirit becomes more and more unhappy in a vague sense of the term. Because after death he will be forced to live the memory of acts that do not correspond to what he would have wanted. So he will return to the world of death, hoping one day to return to matter to correct man. But it is not the same man he will want to correct, but a memory in a new body. Hence the reincarnation. Until he has gained enough experience to make the fusion with the mortal. Then will he be free from the astral. And can man be immortalized? That is, unrelated to the astral? When the spirit returns to the plane of matter, its destiny is in suspense, in the sense that it does not know if fusion will be achieved. Because for the fusion to be achieved, he needs a lot of experience with the mortal. Now this experience is long, and when the cycle of evolution begins, as it is the case at the end of the 20th century, the spirit of man, the most advanced spirit in experience, is the first to experience fusion with the mortal. It is difficult for man, for the ego, to understand why the spirit must be unified with the mortal in order to be liberated from matter and return to light. Because man has a valorous conception of the spirit and does not understand the laws of form. The spirits of form have instituted, created, the human form and its evolutionary plan. And the role of the spirits of light is to bring this form back to a stage of evolution superior to matter. Therefore, the spirit of light must merge with the material form of man to elevate this form beyond the laws of matter. By this very fact, the spirit of form sees this part of the creative plane realized, and the spirit of light can enlighten the form so that it becomes a great addition to the scale or evolutionary picture of the universal. Man must get used to seeing himself according to the spirit of light that inhabits him and not according to his senses, which give him the habit of matter and make him lose sight of the creative plan of evolution. Otherwise, man can never understand the mysteries of life and creation. It would only be the object of a cosmic experiment, projected to the confines of a galaxy with no precise purpose. But for man to see himself clearly in the great and vast plan, his ego, his inferior being, must be unified with the spirit of light that inhabits him. For it is the light of this spirit that gives man the intelligence of his planetary situation and eventually allows him to realize that he and the spirit are one. This unity is essential, because it cancels the suffocating power of the psychological spell that hides the reality of the ego from the ego, and thus prevents man from living a real and endless life. For the spirit, one day, through fusion, must bring the mortal with him into the spheres where the creation of man must continue. Thus the assassination of humanity was perpetrated against man. That is, against the spirit of man, so that man could be and eventually experience fusion. That is, immortality. That is, continuity in consciousness. So the spirit loves man, because the spirit and man are one. But man must recognize, must possibly understand by himself, the different aspects of reality, of his reality, of the reality of his origin. The spirit of form and the spirit of light are two different spirits. One contains or preserves the original idea of its creation, while the other exploits, by its movement in the cosmos, the different aspects of energy in order to allow the form, once condensed in matter, to rise and become more and more perfect, more and more luminous, that is, more and more similar to it. So one day, then, man and the spirit of light, because of the unity they will form together, will allow the famous saying of the ancient knowledge of humanity, in which it was said that man was created in the image of God, to be realized in time. Indeed, man has been created in form in the image of very sophisticated entities, very sophisticated intelligences. And this form must one day return to the origin, must return and be unified to this energy. So the human being, the one who has lived for millennia, who has been subjugated and who represents a still very imperfect outline of a future evolution, must realize today that humanity has indeed been murdered. Murdered in a sense that can only be understood by the mind in man, that can only be absorbed selfishly in terms of emotion or intellect by a man who is increasingly fused with his creative intelligence. That is, his mind. And from the moment when man realizes that humanity has indeed been murdered, it is possible for him to understand the different stages of involution, the different evolutionary needs, which have allowed man to be deceived so that he could, with experience, realize the difference between good and evil, good and true. The aspects of involution that characterized the assassination of humanity and that were part of the progression of human mental and emotional development were necessary. But today, now that man is entering a new phase of evolution in which he will experience a certain mutation, it is obvious that in this process man can no longer live in the same way in the mind as he knew in the past. He can no longer live in the same way in the astral emotional as he knew in the past. Since man must change. Since man must be totally different. Man, the ego, does not want to change in one direction, and in another direction. He wants to change. At some point there must be a break. But it is not the ego that can make the break. It is the energy. It is the spirit. And when the spirit begins to do the work in man, there is a break in the ego. So there is a change in the mind and in the emotional, and so there is a gradual stop. There is a possible retention of what we call the effects or consequences of the murder of humanity. But man cannot rationalize the new cycle. Man cannot rationalize fusion. Man cannot rationalize the vibratory activity of the mind through his bodies, through his ego. Because man is incapable at the ego level of understanding the depth of the plane of involution, of understanding the infinite laws of this descent into matter. So he is obliged at some point to begin to live off the energy of the spirit. Thus to transmute mental matter, emotional matter and eventually material matter, under the pressure of the spirit in its descent, in its fusion. The human being, egotistically speaking, is incapable of realizing the dimensionality of his involutive experience. He is incapable of taking possession, in its totality, of the memory of humanity, of the memory of the stewardship and management activities that have taken origin in the planes that underlie the matter. So the cosmos is much too big for the ego. Even if the cosmos is very large for the ego, this does not mean that the ego cannot understand the mechanicity, the illusions within itself, created by the astral because of involution. And this is a fact. And this fact can only be illuminated by fusion, can only be illuminated by the descent of the spirit into the mortal. And when this process accelerated, developed, man, the ego, begins to realize that in the past the whole of humanity, and even today, has been maintained in such a powerful chain that only fusion, contact between spirit and mortal, can break. Thus the assassination of humanity, in the terms here given, represents involution, represents, in all possible and imaginable ways by an ego, how forces in parallel worlds can manipulate on the material plane, through the mental and astral matter of man, the conditions of involution. The murder of humanity represents the powerlessness of man. And as long as the ego is not able to see, feel, realize itself, realize its fragility, realize and be aware how easily he can be manipulated by the energy of form, he cannot realize the power of energy through form. And if he does not realize the power of energy through form, how can he have access to the energy of intelligence that can throw into the form of clarity so that man, astrally speaking or mentally speaking, is never subjugated by form but uses form for its expansion, and is never cornered on the wall of experience, the wall of ignorance, the wall of disappointment, the wall of domination. Man in the past has lived upside down, and tomorrow man will have to live upside down. But man cannot recognize the difference between the back and the front when he is unconscious. In the same way that the astrologer cannot see the difference between the top and the bottom when he is suspended in the vacuum.